Hi there, I'm David Harvey, and I'm here with John Andrews, and this is the Two Texts podcast. In this podcast, we're two friends in two different countries, here every 2 weeks talking about two different texts from the Bible. This is our second season. It's about the miracles of Jesus. And this is episode 4, and it's called Water Walking. Okay, John, so we talked about the feeding of the 5,000. That story continues. So our second text for this week is the immediately following story that happens, as if one miracle in a day isn't enough. The story of the feeding of 5,000 follows the story that you're going to read for us just now in Matthew chapter 14, and it begins in verse 22.
Yeah. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, that's somewhere between 3 and 6 a.m. in the morning, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," Jesus said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized Jesus, they sent word to all the surrounding country. People brought all their sick to him and begged him to let the sick just touch the edge of his cloak. And all who touched him were healed. Wow. Come on.
It's an intense day for the disciples.
Absolutely is. Absolutely is.
They have a lot going on. So it's an interesting turn, isn't it? Because we've had the feeding of the 5,000, this very public miracle, which is got so much resonance to stuff that's going on in the Old Testament, Moses. There's abundance and scarcity, and then we have this very private miracle that might actually be a little more complex to see what's actually going on here. Like, what do you make of a miracle like this? Because it seems, well, it's sort of random at some level. It's like, oh, look, there's Jesus. He's walking on the water. And there's almost a sense, particularly in Mark's gospel, that, well, I mean, Mark literally says it, and he meant to pass them by. So it's
Very
like
interesting.
it's just, he's trying to walk past, and it's only when the disciples start having a sort of meltdown that Jesus intervenes. So, I mean, what do you make of a miracle like this, John?
Yeah, I think it's a great reflection, David, and I think the sort of private nature of this, and can I say, hope my listeners don't sort of throw things with their computer when I say this. It almost
or
seems,
throw their phone out the car.
yeah. Don't do that. But it almost seems, can I say, pointless. And I suppose it's your term of random. So we totally get why he does what he does with the 5,000. This sort of is something that seems a little bit random. And at first we're going, well, what's the point of that? But of course, I think it is perhaps leaning into something that Jesus wants his disciples to get and understand and grab. And of course, we get a little bit of that when Jesus gets back into the boat and the wind dies down, and they say, truly you are the Son of God. So there's something maybe being revealed here to them in a dramatic way that is about helping them to start connect some of the dots. So what you've just experienced with the feeding of the 5,000 plus is a miracle, but there's a greater point to this miracle. There's a greater journey to this. This is not just about helping people in a wilderness. This is now about what I am here to actually achieve. And perhaps actually Jesus is revealing something of himself specifically and uniquely to this core group. We assume the 12 are in the boat. I mean, we're just making the assumption they're all in that boat. So there's something they're getting to see, which no one else is getting to see. And I think when you have a situation where only a certain group of people are getting to see something, then maybe there's a reason for that. So Jesus is transfigured a bit with Moses and Elijah there, and only 3 disciples get to see that.
Yes.
Well, what's going on there? So I think it's probably this almost private demonstration of his power and glory is for their eyes only at this stage, maybe to help them connect some dots that the previous miracle have created.
It's interesting that we talked about this in the last episode, that Jesus is in a place of grief. So his cousin has been executed. He's found that out in the morning. He's then still found a place of compassion, and he's been trying to get to a quiet place to pray. The crowd follow him. His compassion overwhelms his need for a quiet space. But then he does manage to get himself alone and up the mountain by himself. So he is coming from a slightly different perspective now. You see this with Jesus on quite a few occasions, doesn't he? That Jesus wants to be somewhere else, to be with God, to get some alone prayer time. There's probably a whole discipleship lesson for us there about if Jesus needs alone space to pray, we probably do as well. And I think it's worth mentioning that within the mythology of Israel, the water is not a place that is overly comfortable. So the water is the place of chaos. Even in the Genesis story, the deep is this kind of, so you don't see a lot of water skiing in Jesus' day. So fishermen are brave people. They're the people that go out and battle these seas, battle the deep and the chaos. And there's a lot of, you don't see it so much in scripture, but you definitely see, although it is there in some of the Old Testament stuff, but you definitely see it in the contemporary texts, that there was a bit of fear around the water. The water was a scary place. So being in the water at night, I don't really know that I want to do that. And so then a stormy waters is even more scary then, because you're now reading this in terms of the mythology that you've grown up with. Stormy waters, it's not just, these are big waves, but there's something going on here. And you see this at a few points throughout the Gospels, I think, that Jesus' control over the elements, as we would say it, his control over the seas and the storms, is something that makes the disciples draw connections to who Jesus is. Even at the end of this story, the fact that when Jesus gets into the boat with them, things calm down. Like, whoa, who is this? Because he's not simply calming nature in the mind of the disciples now. He's calming the evil forces of the cosmos. And I don't want it to sound too weird, John, so forgive me if it is sounding that. No. But there's extra levels going on as to what they're seeing in a story like this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally does. Totally does. And I would concur that there would be a backstory to this, that again, Matthew's audience would understand and see some of the implications and ramifications of that. Of course, it's probably a sideways step, but it's worth a mention. Of course, when I think of stormy waters and boats, my mind immediately goes to the prophet Jonah. So you've got an incredible story there of someone trying to escape the purposes of God, and it's the Lord that sends the storm. It's the Lord who creates, if you like, or sends the great fish. It's the Lord who then calms the storm when Jonah is swallowed by the great fish.
Mm.
And of course, you have this Jonah's imagery of descending into the depths of the deep, this watery grave, whether literal or metaphorical, and this sort of sense that this turbulence is all about wrestling with God's purpose, God's identity, God's desire, and human autonomy. And all of those things are going on. It's probably a stretch, but I think that this is a safe space to do a few wee stretches without pushing heresy. But of course, they are on their way to a Gentile arena. They are on their way to the Gennesaret. This will ultimately be the arena of the 10 cities, the 10 Greek, the Decapolis. So it is interesting that you've got a nuance of they're making their way to somewhere. And as they're doing that, there is this incredible demonstration of who Jesus is in the context of this, and not only the calming of the storm, but the ability to enable others to engage with him in that storm. So yeah, I wouldn't want to push that too far. I wouldn't necessarily preach that on a Sunday morning, but for me, again, as we've seen, there's often these little pop-ups, these little threads, and some of those threads lead to something, and some of those threads may not. But it leans into your idea of discomfort around the water.
Yes, this kind of cosmic chaos of the water I think is expressed in it's a ghost. Yeah. They immediately assume that there's some sort of spiritual apparition going on here. It's like you go to Disneyland into the haunted house, right? And even if you don't believe in ghosts and things like that, you've grown up with ghost stories and haunted house stories, and you create the right environments for that, and it all gets a little spooky, doesn't it? So absolutely. Imagine the disciples, their haunted house and ghost stories are all told about the sea. So they find themselves in the sea at night. It just all starts to feel a little bit spooky. And so it's a ghost. It kind of gives us this insight into almost the mythological world of the disciples and why they draw those lines, and beautifully how Jesus is going to redraw all of those lines.
Yeah. And I think too, it's remembering these boys are probably pretty worn out. I mean, they've had a long day. They hope to get rid of the crowd, which may have lent into the fact not only did we not have enough food and bread, but actually we're whacked. Yes. And it would be great to get rid of this crowd. Not only does Jesus keep the crowd, but he feeds the crowd. So that's going to take a while to do all of that. Yes. So we're probably now well into late evening when they're getting into this boat, and it is between 3 and 6 o'clock in the morning when this happens. So these boys are probably pretty tired as well. You've got physical fatigue kicking in, probably some of them literally waking up from a sleep when they hear the shouting. And you've got the uncertainty of the storm. And if they're in the standard first century fishing boat that we think they were in, the fishermen in the group may have been fairly comfortable with that experience, but I wouldn't have been. I'd have been looking, right, where's the life preservers, boys? And when do we get to the other end? So there's a lot going on. There's a lot emotionally that's going on. A lot spiritually that's going on. There's some cultural stuff that's feeding into their fears and their anxieties. And then Jesus comes walking across the water in the midst of this windy, stormy moment. And it is quite dramatic, really, as a demonstration.
I'm just reflecting back on our resonances in all of this. We've had the feeding of the 5,000. So we've had bread in the desert, like Moses. I was thinking about Psalm 77. Your way was through the sea. Your path through mighty waters, your footsteps were unseen. The path through the sea when the Israelites were exiting Egypt is such an important story in the narrative of Israel and the narrative of Jesus' people. You can't help but wonder, there's a little bit. We've had a feeding in the desert miracle, and now we've got a water-related miracle going on as well. This could also be the sort of new Moses imagery coming up a little bit in all of this.
And of course, what a way to supersede Moses. Moses, by God's grace and power, opened a way through the sea. Jesus walks on the sea. And again, you are looking at something that if you're wanting to grab the threads of Moses within the Matthew text, then here is another nudge towards this supremacy over the elements in order to get God's people to where they need to go.
Yes.
And I think that potentially is there as a thought process, as well as just the incredible, astounding miracle, that I think that nuance is potentially there.
So, but just changing it up for a little bit, it strikes me that a resonance in the story, and I'm curious as to where you would want to go with this. There's a lot of talk about fear. So I just was looking, they're in this context, the wind's against them. They see him walking on the sea. He's terrified. It's a ghost. They cry out in fear. And then you get Peter's afraidness. There's this strong fear resonance in this text, in perhaps in the absence of Jesus, and even in the presence of Jesus. This is the emotion that's driving this story a little bit, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely there. And I think again we're entering into the human experience of these disciples. So even being around Jesus, even being with Jesus, they're still exposed to the challenges of the everyday life in which they're living. And they're not protected from that, from the point that they're not touched by it, but are being then brought into an experience where, how do I address those fears? What is the answer to those fears? How do we overcome those fears in the midst of that? And if our listeners can remember, in our previous text, when we looked at the feeding of the 5,000 plus, we talked about God being enough, that he is enough in our need, that he can provide our need. Well, this leans into the idea that he is enough in our fear. He's enough in our weakness, in our vulnerability. So there's nothing that makes humans feel vulnerable like being in a situation where they are completely out of control, where they have no control. I mean, like probably many of our listeners, I've been on planes that have hit turbulence. I remember being on one plane that hit such powerful turbulence that I remember holding a glass of juice. And as the plane hit a pocket of turbulence that was so severe, no word of exaggeration, my body, my cup went down the way with the plane, and my juice stayed in the air. It descended so quickly, it went down so fast that my juice and my ice remained in the air. And of course, eventually, what goes up must come down, and my juice ended up on my tray mostly. Now, I want to say, there you are, a human with all your abilities and all your dreams and all your desires, and you're sitting on a plane that is in the middle of turbulence, and you cannot do a single thing about that. I mean, all you can do is sit there with your seatbelt on, praying to Jesus that this thing does not go down. And the sense of vulnerability within that. Now, that's not a nice feeling for humans. For humans to feel vulnerable, for humans to feel totally exposed and weak, either in the midst of a literal storm or a storm of another kind, will expose our frailty. So just as the frailty of the crowd is exposed in its hunger, here they are. They've been so preoccupied by following Jesus, they've forgotten that they're hungry. They've forgotten that the shops have closed and that there's no way we're all going to get dinner tonight or supper tonight. And yet Jesus says, I am enough. And here we have a group of his disciples fighting the waves, fighting the wind, fighting their fear, fighting their vulnerability. And it's just so beautiful. He says, immediately. I mean, I think there's 3 or 4 references to the word immediately in that little passage. Immediately, he says to them, it's I. Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. So once he hears them say it's a ghost, he goes, immediately. He responds to their vulnerability and their weaknesses. Don't be afraid. It's me. I'm enough for you, even in the storm. And I think that's absolutely beautiful, beautiful idea there.
Let's just hang around in that for a moment. So a lot of translations have something like, take heart, it is I, have no fear. Tharseo, the Greek, actually, be cheerful, take heart, be cheerful, have courage. I just think it's worth mentioning, though, that what Jesus says often gets translated as, it is I. But I just want to push into that a little bit more than that, because they all keep, it's quite interesting actually to look at in the Greek of this, all three authors, so this appears in Matthew, Mark, and John, this story does, right? So Luke skips this one, John, sorry about that. But for whatever reason, goes back to what we were saying in the last episode. For whatever reason, Luke goes, "Meh, I'm not going to tell that story." So we had enough excitement for one day. And I don't mean that irreverently, John. It just is cute. It's so fascinating about like, why would you drop a story like this? But interestingly, even though if you actually look across a lot of English translations, the sentence of Jesus, bizarrely enough, across the three different Gospels gets translated ever slightly differently. I mean, very marginally. But in the Greek, it's exactly the same words across all of the versions. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, it's the same thing. And the word that Jesus uses, where it says "it is I," is ego eimi, which literally means I am. It's an emphatic sense of I am. So eimi in Greek means I am. So it's just the verb to be, I am. But when you add ego, which is the pronoun I, you get ego eimi. So it's a really emphatic sense of I am. So he doesn't say, I feel like the translators they miss something here for us, because I want to talk about the pattern as to what happens next in a moment. But take heart, it is I. Actually, what you get is take heart, I am. Boom. And now I think a lot of our readers will go, whoa, wait a minute. I think, and bear in mind, we're riffing heavy over Matthew 14 on Moses' similarities. Surely there's some sort of connection going on here between God coming to Moses and saying, who shall I say? Moses says, well, who am I going to tell? What's your name? Right? If I'm going to go and if I'm going to tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go free, what's your name? And what you get is, tell him, I am sent you. And of course, it's worth noticing and mentioning that in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, whenever this phrase I am is used as the name of God at some level, they always use this phrase ego eimi. So it's always the emphatic I am. And now another little piece just to help our listeners. In John's gospel, all of the I am sayings of Jesus, I am the bread of life, I am the good shepherd, I am the way, the truth of life, are also ego eimi. And when Jesus is facing up to an angry crowd in John 7 who are a little bit uncertain about things he's saying, and Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. He says, before Abraham was, ego eimi. And they pick up rocks and start trying to throw them at him because their interpretation is, by saying ego eimi, you have aligned yourself you have made yourself like God, which of course for many Christian readers, you're going to sit quite comfortably with that, right? So all of that thrown up into the air, which is a bit messy, to me changes what Jesus is doing here. So he comes out to them and they're like, oh my goodness, it's a ghost. And immediately Jesus says, take courage, I am. The very opposite of a ghost. It's stunning, isn't it?
Oh, it's breathtaking. It's breathtaking. And it could be that, I mean, who knows? It could be the translators are a little bit nervous about driving that translation. That actually, well, he's clearly saying it's just me. But if we're, and this I suppose is the difficulty a translator faces, do we simply translate the literalism of the text? This is how you would write that phrase if you were like translating it into good English.
Yes.
Or do we try to understand the context of the translation and therefore Jesus may have been saying something else? And I think that's a really tricky tension for them, isn't it? Where actually a literal translation would be, yeah, that's fine.
Yes.
That sort of reads well. Probably if you read any of the paraphrases on it, you would get that idea. I'd be shocked if any of them push back on that. But of course, if we're leaning into Moses in the context, then for him to say, take courage, I am. And of course, that absolutely seems to lean into the disciples' conclusion. Truly, you are the Son of God. They are making the link that in saying, I am, this is not blasphemous. That actually we've just seen a demonstration that he is the I am. Because he's done something that not even Moses was able to do in terms of walking on the water. So you're getting. I certainly think there's mileage in that. In fact, I was just reading it this morning in my daily devotions, David, where Jesus in the Johannine text is in the garden. The mob come to get him. And he says, "Who are you looking for?" Jesus of Nazareth. And he goes, "I am he." And they all fall down.
Yes.
They all fall over. So something, you're going, whoa, what's just gone on there? So something dynamic and powerful is associated with the idea of I am when Jesus is using it in his, as it were, designated sense, not just the grammatical sense, but he's using this as part of the connectedness to the I am who sent Moses, to the I am who called Abraham, to the I am who is bread and vine and light. You know what I mean?
Yes.
It's my goodness, or something. So you've got an I am here in the midst of a calming storm, walking on the water, and of course, right in the middle of it, this gorgeous, beautiful, intimate story of saving Peter's life as well. It's all going on in the context of I am.
And there's a couple of things that are worth mentioning that when you dig into John's gospel as a reader, he is fundamentally drawing these parallels for you. He is making I am statements all over the place because he wants you to see that it is Jesus. The emphatic, it's I am, not anything else. So I am the bread of life. It was often, a lot of the I am sayings relate to beliefs about the Bible, actually, in Jesus' time, beliefs about the Torah. Your word is a lamp unto my feet. And Jesus comes in and says, actually, now, I am the light of the world. Absolutely. He's redrawing the boundaries again and pulling it all back into himself. And I think it's worth mentioning as well that in the Greek translations of the Old Testament, the I am language was used in a lot of contexts to mark off God's name. So it's hard to imagine. And because in more normal day-to-day language, you wouldn't say, if you walked out into the field in Jesus's day, right, and said, "Who's here to play football?" People are not going to put their hand up and go, "Ego, Amy," right? They're going to put their hand up and go, "Amy," right? I am, yes. Right? So the emphatic sense of it seems to be drawing this parallel towards the name of God. And now, why I think that's quite interesting, and there's so much that you could say about the I am statements, and I think we're again going to have to probably spend a series at some point talking about John's I am statements because they are so good, aren't they?
Yes, please.
But notice the transition. If you actually read this, and I know that this is like we're reading miracle stories and trying to read them normally, right? But they see him walking on the sea. They're terrified. It's a ghost, they say, because they cry out in fear. Immediately he says, "I am." And Peter answers him, Lord. Okay, so again, Lord is one of the Greek words that's used to define the name of God as well in that sort of sense. But Peter answers, "Lord, if it is you, bid me to come out onto the water." So you've got to somehow relate in the storytelling. How do we get from afraid of the ghost to I'm going to come and walk on the water too? And I'd suggest that the I am is the catalyst for this change. That this is God is in this space. God is here.
Totally.
Do you resonate with that?
100%. I think it'll help so many of our listeners so much. Because it does, the gear change in the middle of the story is colossal, right? We've gone from, we're terrified, we're all going to die, it's a ghost, to any chance I can get out of the boat and walk on the water with you in the middle of the story. I mean, it just does not make sense.
Yes.
And the only thing that makes someone like Peter, remember a seasoned fisherman, get out of the boat is he's heard something. He hasn't just seen something because they thought it was a ghost.
Yes.
So what flips them from a seeing is the hearing, and he hears something that goes, "The I am is on the water," and this revelatory moment, this lean in moment where he has heard something. He's heard something that's saying to him now, "Get out of the boat, and Lord, if that is you, bid me come." In his language, he may have probably used Adonai. Adonai, call me out of this out of this boat. And Jesus says, come. Now, and again, it doesn't make sense. I know it's Jesus saying it, but no one's going to get out of the boat on the basis of just come unless they've heard something else.
Yes.
He's not getting out of the boat, I think, on the basis of the word come. He's getting out of the boat on the basis of I am. I think that's the $64 million moment. Now, I love the idea of Peter walking on the word come. I've preached on that. I think it preaches. I think it works. That the word of Jesus, come, becomes the solid rock on which he stands. I mean, I love all that. And I think that lives there. And that's definitely, it has mileage. But I think what causes Peter to go, Lord, if it's you, is the statement, I am.
It's
powerful. It flips the story. I think if our listeners can get the I am in the middle of this, it completely transforms the story. And then it moves from what felt like, and I hope our listeners weren't offended by certainly my language. It felt like something that felt almost random and a bit pointless to, that's the point right there. That's the point.
And that's why I think it's worth slowing down and not just reducing this to, oh, look, Jesus can walk on water. Isn't Jesus cool? And I've heard this miracle so often referred to in that sort of level that we almost unintentionally make it appear simply a magic trick, and where there's actually something profound. And even the discipleship language here, look at Peter's, like, spend some time as a reader of the text. Lord, if it's you, bid me come. Right? Like, what a phenomenal confession from Peter at that point. That to in the midst of all of the chaos that's going around him in the storm. And I think it's Stanley Hauerwas in his commentary on Matthew. He sort of makes this point that Peter then later becomes the rock of the church, right? So upon this rock, I'll build my church, Jesus says. So Hauerwas says, so when we read this text, it's also a message to the church. The church, for us as the people of God, the call is to say, Lord, if it's you, bid me come. There's the invitation from us to the Lord that we might join him far from the shore. It's quite something, isn't it?
Oh, I love that. And I think I love the link in even the confession of Peter, which we bump into a couple of chapters later in Matthew 16. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now, again, it's either that revelation, Peter gets there and then, and Jesus says, this wasn't, you didn't learn this was revealed to you by my Father. But sometimes we might be tempted to read that as a revelation. It just comes at that moment, which is, I'm cool with, absolutely fine with. But could it be the revelation, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, has been seeded in this moment, as far as the Matthew text is concerned? If Peter in the boat goes, the I am is on the water, and he says, Lord, bid me come, and all right, we know Peter sinks, and we'll get to that, I'm sure, in a moment, but the fact that he responds to a revelatory hearing of something, which then a couple of chapters later, I think then explodes into this, you're the Christ, you are the Son of a living God. And of course then Jesus says, and on this rock. Now, I know there's a lot of controversy around the whole thing. Who's the rock? What's the rock? But for me, it feels like an easy fit to lean into the idea that the rock is the confession that Peter walked on the water on. So if Peter is seeing the I am on the water and is in reality walking on the water to that revelation, then the connection that revelation, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, you are the I am, is connected to Matthew 16 as the rock on which not the church walks on water, but the church is built, the ecclesia is built. So
Yes.
potentially the Matthew 14 story and the Matthew 16 story are connected. And I think that's worth exploring, that link.
Yeah.
He walks to the I am, then he confesses that he's the Christ. So
I love that, John. And I think you're right. And it's probably worth mentioning very briefly. There is a lot of nervousness amongst Christians often around the Peter's classification as the rock. Right? And I think some of this is rooted in historical, Protestant and Catholic divides. I suppose my comment on it would be simply to say, bear in mind that discussion about, because what we hear is there's a question, is Jesus instituting Peter as the Pope when he calls him out to be the rock? And I mean this with great sensitivity to our Catholic listeners and our Protestant listeners that we would have. Just bear in mind that whole discussion is a discussion that begins at very least 400 years later and may even begin 1500 years later. So when Jesus and Peter are having a conversation about, hey, you Peter, which means little rock, I'm going to make you this big rock. I think that you can, as a Bible reader, forget the next 1500 years of discussion and rather connect that to what you then see happening at the day of Pentecost, where you actually see Peter becoming this catalyst leader of the beginning of the church. And I think it's an important, and sorry to kind of move the conversation somewhere that we didn't expect to go. It's worth always mentioning there's a lot of times that modern or more recent discussions about pieces of theology get imported back onto the text, don't they? So there's no sense that Peter or Jesus were thinking about that at that particular moment. And I think that, to me, that's always helped me to just release myself from worrying. I want both Catholics and Protestants to read this text and hear this text and not get caught up in our later divisions, if that's, maybe I'm being too bold as to assume what we can do in a conversation around the Bible. But we've got to be careful of importing ideas.
Oh, absolutely. But I mean, that's been one of the things we've constantly reflected on together in our two text series, is that we are prone constantly to read back into eisegesis is a very, very dangerous thing. And we're reading something in. We are all vulnerable to that and prone to that. And I think the beauty of making a sort of a journey that we're doing together as two friends is that it forces us just read it as it is. Don't read it with 2,000 years of church history layered back on top of it. Read it as it is right now. And if you just read it as it is, read it as Matthew says it, then there is this gorgeous, I think, more than tenuous link between the I am who's standing on the water, calling Peter, happens to be Peter, who responds. And he responds not because he's crazy and he has a death wish, but because he's had a revelation. Something has happened in Peter that says, if you're really the I am, then bid me come. Okay. Now some people will go, well, no, he wasn't saying if it's the I am. He was just saying, Jesus, if it's you. Yeah, but he's never seen Jesus do this before. He's never seen Jesus walk on water before. This is a whole new, literally, excuse the pun, out of the boat experience. So he is absolutely in uncharted territory with this. So something is getting him out of the boat. If you're prepared to go with the I am conversation, which I think is just must be considered at the very least, then Matthew 16, when it pops up and we read it later, you go, oh, where have I heard that before? And this is where it potentially, so it could be the revelation we're seeing Peter fully articulate in 16 is seated in 14.
And so you get this, and this is important. If you read Genesis 1 as a Jewish reader, what you see is the Lord, the Adonai, Yahweh, I am. He controls the chaos of the waters. Like we don't read this often, but you get the sense there's chaos and the Holy Spirit is over the deep. And then what you start to see if you and go back and read Genesis 1 and watch for it now, that the first few days of progress in the Genesis story are the Lord controlling the waters. He's pushing back waters from the land. He's separating sky, the waters of the sky from the waters of the sea. So I love this nuance that Peter goes, well, if it's I am, I can go out and be next to him on the waters because he has control over the chaos of the deep and the waters of the deep. And so in Mark and Matthew, you see it in very matter of factual. So Peter got out of the boat and walked on water and came to Jesus. Yes. It's like Matthew has this brilliant sense of occasionally this amazing language, and other time he says this with all the grandeur of, and David and John wandered down the platform of the train station and got on the train. Like this. So Peter got out of the boat and walked in the water and went to Jesus. People accuse the gospel writers sometimes of manufacturing these stories to say things about Jesus. This is a common criticism over the last several centuries, isn't it? That these stories are made up, and they're basically making up these mythological stories to make points about Jesus. And I always find myself thinking, and I mean this with respect, I should be a better opponent and politer than this. But when people say stuff like that to me, and I mean learned scholars say that, I always want to go, have you actually read these texts? If I was going to sit down and make up a story about Jesus walking on water, I'd do it better than this. Like, it's so matter of fact. You cannot accuse Matthew of pomp and ceremony here. So Peter got out of the boat and he walked over to Jesus on the water. It's like, there's no, it's not how you make up a story like this. You do a much better. You've got kids. I've got a daughter. When they make up, stories, imaginative stories, they're way more grand and glitzy than this. But Matthew talks about it, like I say, as if he also had said, Peter got up, out of the boat, walked on water. And then also Peter one day went to the shops and bought some lamb. And I know it's not the strongest argumentative point, John, but it just strikes me that there's something beautiful about the simplicity and the matter-of-factness of this.
For sure.
And he walks on water.
And again, it's recognizing that into the ordinariness of our faith, there is an expectation of the supernatural, that in the everyday, we believe in the I am. We believe in the I am who can step into my job, who can step into my family, who can step into my relationships, who can step into literal or metaphorical storms, but actually who wants to live with me in the ordinary but yet in the ordinary demonstrate something of his glory and something that is truly not ordinary and supernatural and spectacular. And I love how it reads and how simply it sort of reads. And of course, the matter-of-factness, it seems, in which Peter walks then suddenly leads us to this next dramatic moment, which for me demonstrates a little bit of a nuance in the text I want to allude to. It says there, verse 30, seeing now the wind, he was afraid. Okay. And he began to sink. Now, what's really interesting is, I think in our passage, David, there's a lovely tension between the reaction to something when you see it and the reaction of something when you hear it. Mm-hmm. So, for example, our first reference, during the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to them. When the disciples saw him, they were terrified. Okay? And they cried out. But look at the next bit. But Jesus immediately said to them, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come. Peter responds to a word. So, I am, come. So Peter responds to that word, walks on water. So he's walking on the water based on what he's heard. He starts to sink based on what he sees. All right. Now, again, could be overcooking that, but I think there's a bit of a sandwich there. They're terrified because of what they see. Peter sinks because of what he sees, but he walks on the basis of what he heard. And again, in a Jewish nuance, the sort of idea of hearing is a stronger one than seeing. I think that's a stronger idea in a faith context than seeing is the hearing. Now, we would lean into seeing in terms of revelation, our eyes are opened. Open my eyes, O Lord, that I may see wonderful things in your law, the psalmist says in Psalm 119. So there's no problem with the idea of seeing. But there is in this story a lovely contrast between what they see and how they respond and what they hear and how they
Yes.
respond. And I think there's something going on there, David. Seeing the wind, he was afraid
Yes.
and began to sink. And I think that the world of revelation, in following the I am and following the Lord, we've got to learn to hear more than we see.
Yes.
I think if we can lean into what we know by hearing, then it allows our hearing allows us to inform our seeing, that actually we then can interpret the wind in a different way if we've heard certain things.
Yeah.
But if we allow our lives to be driven by simply what we see on the surface, then it will always challenge what we've heard. So I just think there's a couple of rabbits in there worth chasing for our listeners to think about. When they saw, they were afraid. When they heard, he responded.
Deuteronomy 6:4, hear, O Israel, the
Mm.
Lord your God is the only God, or the Lord your God is one. It's difficult not to think that maybe there's something going on in that. I think it's Leonard Sweet who I first encountered this idea that your eyes are pretty much fixed size your entire life, but your ears never stop growing. And
wow.
And this so your ears get bigger as you get older, and they continue to do so. And Len Sweet makes the point that we actually need to listen much more than we do. We're overstimulated by visual stimuli and understimulated by listening. And so I love that, John, that this idea that there's a seeing. And even it's interesting in verse 30, he saw the wind and he was afraid and began to sink. And even in the studying for talking about this today, I found myself reflecting on, have I ever noticed that order before? I think if you'd said to me, if I was being honest, I think if you said to me what happened, I would say Peter started sinking and was afraid. But actually, he becomes afraid and then starts sinking. He allows the visual stimuli to overwhelm what he's heard, and that leads to fear. So the fear comes before the sinking, which is quite... It's just a little interesting nuance in terms of the order of the way Matthew tells the story there.
It is. And I think when you read... So like one of the things I love to do, I think I've said this to our listeners before, I love to read the Bible out loud.
Yeah.
So it's funny, when you read a text, you sometimes hear the sort of rhythms of the text or even repeat ideas. So like when I was reading this and reading, I kept hearing the word immediately pops up, which is there. But also then you hear, as you read it out loud, they were afraid because they thought it was a ghost. They saw him. Then Peter responds to a hearing, and then there's a dramatic moment with another seeing. Now, when you read that out loud and you read it slowly, you're seeing a sandwich there. There's a seeing, hearing, seeing, sandwich. Now, is that just a coincidence? It could be. And of course, our listeners pay their money, take their choice sort of thing, in the sense of going, yeah, I'll decide whether I believe or not. But I don't ignore those little connectors. I see them so often in the text, little literary nuances that point to something. And again, that revelation that comes via hearing, which in a Jewish worldview is strongly rooted in Shema, hearing and doing. You heard, the proof that you've heard something is that you do something. That's the sort of Shema idea. Hearing and doing are almost synonymous within the multi-layers of that beautiful, beautiful word. And of course, it's often translated obey in the Torah, but there is no verb for obedience in the Torah, which is quite striking. It's
Yeah.
most of the time it's Shema. It's the idea, I've
Yeah.
heard, therefore I obey. Peter is getting
Listen.
out of the
Yeah.
boat because he's heard.
Mm.
So I think it's quite powerful as a lean
Mm.
into the sort of Jewish context of that.
I love as well, the preacher in me wants to make a big deal of this, but I'm just going to drop it, and then our listener can turn it into the big deal, and they can go and preach it. They can go and preach it. As we've alluded to before, anything you hear in two texts you can steal for a sermon, right? But just notice verse 26. You just alluded to it, but I just want to circle back to it for a second. It's a ghost, and they cried out in fear, but immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, have courage. And then verse 30, he was afraid and began to sink, and he cried out, Lord, save me. And immediately. Jesus is immediately at both the points of fear in the story. The immediatelys appear following fear. Jesus, this time, instead of saying something, he now reaches out his hand and catches him, and then asks him the question. And I love it. It's kind of, Peter gets told by Jesus, you have little faith, right? And I always, and let me just jump into some Greek where you have little faith was always a condemnation when I grew up hearing this. Oh, you have little faith, like you failure, Peter, you failure. And it was only when I was reading the Greek of this, that Jesus doesn't say this in the most natural way. He doesn't use the kind of Greek comparables of you of little faith. He actually calls Peter a name, right? And I just find this really fascinating, John, because I actually think it helps us read this just a little bit differently, right? So Peter reaches out and he cries out, Lord, save me, which again, I mean, there's so much, resonance and nuance in that, isn't there? I almost don't want to just jump immediately over that call of Lord, save me. But then this little phrase that he uses, oligopistos, it's an adjective, but it kind of means like micro faith or weak faith. But it's like Jesus calls him, exactly that. It's like he calls him little faith. It's not, and the translators, again, I don't want to feel like I'm rounding on the translators, but oh, you of little faith sounds condemnatory, and we then have utilized this to kind of create anxiety amongst a lot of people about, do I have enough faith or not? But in the Greek, there's this sense of Jesus, Lord, save me, and Jesus catches him, goes, hey, little faith, why did you doubt? Right? It feels pastoral now. It feels like the great rabbi saying, great job on trying here, Peter. Why did you give up? Right? Again, you and I are both always nervous about pushing it too far, but I hear this differently in the Greek by Jesus using this adjective of little faith. Why did you give up on this? It just, I don't want to say it sounds cute, but it feels like it changes the resonance and the tone.
Oh, it does. And can I say, I think it makes more sense. So look, no other disciple got out of the boat and walked on water.
It's a good call.
I mean, this is the first human that I know of in recorded history that's walked on water apart from Jesus. Yeah. So the man, all right, he's sinking, but he has walked on water. And it's clear he walked towards Jesus. I mean, he got down out of the boat. It's very explicit. He got down out of the boat and walked toward Jesus. So then, for Jesus to suddenly say, you numpty, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with your
failure?
It reads wrong. Whereas if there is if you're going to read it with a pastoral nuance, oh, little faith, why did you doubt me? And here's the thing. I think this leans back again to I am, right? Because Jesus is saying, Peter, the key to walking on the water is not something you can muster up in you, but it's trusting in me. It's why did you doubt when you already grabbed the idea I am? Why did you doubt that? I've got you. I'm enough. So again, back to back to the feeding of the fact, I'm enough to feed these people. I'm enough to calm this storm. I'm enough. Peter, why did you allow the storm to take you away from the enoughness of me in this situation? But I think, David, you are absolutely onto something, and I think that reads better. I think it makes sense in the story. It doesn't feel brutal. It's still a rebuke, and I think I've often reflected on the fact that there's almost two sides to love in this action. Immediately he grabs him. You're not going to die, boy. I've got you. No one's dying today, especially not you. But then as he hangs on to him, he says, but why did you doubt me? So there's a gorgeous sort of compassionate shepherding side of rescue, and there's also the compassionate shepherding side that challenges within this. But I think it reads better that way, and I think it's almost like, he's still getting a rebuke, but it's like Jesus is saying, "Hey, well done," but. And I think it makes sense because he has just walked on water.
Yes.
I think it's a bit harsh.
And in truth, we're all sympathetic to Peter because most of us know we wouldn't have done. Well, most of us know that if we are anybody in the story, we're the unnamed disciples that are firmly rooted to their seat in the boat.
That's true. What's Peter doing? Get it back here. I'm not going in after him if he goes under, boys.
Yeah, so, it's true. And so I think there's a sense in which the doubt of Peter resonates with us. And I think we'll talk about this a little later in this series in more depth, but we have an uncomfortable relationship with doubt in the church because we see it as the opposite of faith, and the two can't dwell together. And if you live in that world, this story becomes quite terrifying, because if Jesus is condemning Peter for, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" If it comes in that sort of tone, it's a terrifying story. Because the one thing I can be absolutely certain of in my own life is doubt. Right? Doubt is present in a whole host of areas of my life. And if Jesus is condemning of doubt, then where am I safe with all of my doubts? But if Jesus, like a dad teaching his child to ride their bike, is just like, little faith, come on. Why did you doubt? Why did you stop pedaling? Why did you get off before that hill? It is still rebuke, but it's rebuke based on, you've got it in you to keep doing this. So it's not, I don't know if that metaphor example works, John, but you're teaching your child to ride their bike and they're still dealing with some of the fears. And so occasionally they stop early in the process. You do rebuke, but the rebuke is based on, it's in you, right? You could have kept going. It's not the rebuke based on, you don't know what you're doing, because that's an aggressive and unfair rebuke, to rebuke somebody based on something they cannot do. Right? What I'm hearing for Jesus is the loving hand of the shepherd going, "Peter, you were able to do this. This is in you." And all of a sudden now, my doubts are met with a Jesus who says, "You didn't need to, because I'm with you," rather than the condemning Jesus who just is looking for a chance just to knock me down and leave me in anxiety about not having enough faith. So for me, there's actually and now I could argue from elsewhere in Scripture that we're not hanging all of this just on one little Greek word saying that Jesus is being cute, but it's worth just pointing out how you think of God and how you think God engages with you in your doubts can be quite catastrophic to how you go about living your life. Is your relationship with Jesus one of taskmaster who's waiting for you to fail? Or is it one of excited teacher who just wants to encourage you that you've got it in you to keep going and growing in this? And it can, to me, it changes the resonance of a whole host of things.
Massive. And of course, that family nuance you've leaned into is very much captured, isn't it? In terms of the father will discipline those that are his. So now again, we think of a word like discipline, and we many of us automatically jump to a very negative understanding of discipline. But of course, to discipline in that context, it simply means to disciple, to grow. in the context of learning and affirmation. It's not about brutality or putting someone down. It's always with the idea to build up, to enhance, to increase. And often, of course, it's seen in a Bible worldview in the context of dynamic covenantal understanding and relationship.
Yes.
So again, you used a beautiful example of father and child or parent and child in that sort of respect. I think the Bible leans into that with God's relationship to us. Absolutely.
Yes.
Both in Hebrews and in Proverbs, we get that very explicitly presented to us. If you're then prepared to read that covenantal context of discipline into a moment like this, then it's never a rebuke of death, but always a stimulus to life. It's never about the Lord saying to me, like a school teacher once said to me, bless his heart, "You're an idiot, Andrews. You're a stupid boy. You'll never amount to anything. You'll probably die on the streets of Belfast." That's what I was told as a 10-year-old in school. Grateful to God that was an exceptional moment. But I'm 54 and I can still remember my insides turning. I mean, like I don't want to disturb our listeners, but I almost wet myself as a 10-year-old boy being brought out the front and humiliated in front of my class because I wasn't doing very well in some of my math work I struggled with. Now I'm 54 and I still remember the feeling of humiliation.
Yeah.
So humiliation, fear is a terrible taskmaster in discipleship. If you want to grow great disciples, fear and humiliation will not do it. Now, what you'll end up with is a bunch of subjects who are so afraid to step out of line that they'll do whatever they're told, but you'll not grow life, you'll not grow health, you'll not grow something that's vibrant and dynamic and is worth replicating. And I think Jesus creates this dynamic relationship with his young disciples where every now and again, he has to sideswipe them. He has to get into them. He has to challenge them. But the whole of the context is about them becoming everything they were meant to be. And that's why I think you don't get any massive negative repercussion of Peter getting back in the boat. You don't get this sort of big negative story as a result of it. Well, if Peter gets his head kicked in by Jesus because he's sunk in the sea, what are we going to do? No, instead, what's the reaction? The reaction is, truly, you're the Son of God. Yeah, so whatever has gone on there, it's not the negative, life-sapping type of rebuke that people often think it is. It's maybe, oh, little faith. Come on, lad. You can do this. I know you've got this. And I've got you. And if I've got you, you can do this. And of course, what's fascinating, David, is that Jesus, and our listeners might pick this up, but like Jesus does all of this, it seems, while he's got Peter in the water. Yeah. So it doesn't say Jesus lifted him out of the water. It's sort of immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. It doesn't say lifted him, caught him. And then while he's holding him in the water, he's saying, little faith, come on, why did you doubt? Yeah. And then he pulls him out. And that's when the storm calms down. So I think if you put all of the sort of the hints together, I think you're getting a much more, I mean, it's a rebuke, but it's a much more life-giving, tender rebuke. It's a chastisement that the Bible talks about of the chastisement of a loving father to children he loves, rather than a rebuke of a tyrant to his subjects.
Or the shepherd's crook. We've talked about Jesus over Matthew 14 and the allusions in John to him as the shepherd. It might look firm and harsh, but it's guiding and directing. And it is interesting, isn't it? They get back into the boat, and that's when the wind ceased. If you just want the final piece of proof that this is I am, now the storm has been subject to his will. And the net result, of course, when you're in the presence of I am, is you must worship.
Absolutely. It's gorgeous, isn't it? It's truly, you are the Son of God. And my goodness, that's got to be ultimately our desire, is to hear that he is the I am, and then to see him as the one who can be totally trusted in and to worship him. I love it.
Okay, that's it for this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and we hope that you enjoyed it. If you want to get in touch with either of us about something that we said, you can reach out to us on podcast@twotexts.com or by liking and following the Two Text Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. We always appreciate it that if you like an episode, you'd leave a review for us or a comment, or potentially, if you really like it, share this episode with a friend. Don't forget you can listen to all of our podcasts at www.twotexts.com or wherever you get your podcasts from. But that is it for now. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time with another episode of Two Texts. But until then, goodbye.